Hello again. This is a podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online, the online resource for all construction professionals that's available 24/7. Please don't forget to subscribe at the place you usually get your podcasts so as not to miss a thing from this second series, as well, of course, to visiting our YouTube channel. Welcome to another podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. As usual, Barney, my red Labrador, is here to offer advice and to keep an eye on things. And by the way, Barney and I would really appreciate it if you would like to write a review. If you're new to Duncan Cartlidge Online podcasts, welcome. Please don't forget to subscribe, as well as catching up with previous episodes. If you're already a subscriber, thank you for your support. Please spread the word. In today's jam-packed episode, we'll look at the CIOB Client Guide 2025, Roll Up Your Sleeves or Else, and the Crazy Cost of Net Zero, and the 10-year Infrastructure Plan. Okay, so we'll kick off with the CIOB Client Guide 2025. I'm starting this podcast on a rare positive note. Last week, the CIOB launched the second edition of their Client Guide. Now, I must confess that I've not come across this guide before. What a little gem. The guide contains 76 pages and covers the whole development process from funding through to occupation. Please have a look. It's a free download from the CIOB website, and there have been over 1,400 downloads in the first few days since publication. Never mind clients, it's a great source of reference for anybody, including students and newbies, about how the system works. The RICS should take a look at the really useful range of practical publications offered by the CIOB and compare it with their offering. I mean, does anybody actually read Modus? And while on the subject of the RICS, anybody heard what's happening about the Mothman? Last year saw the RICS hold a series of roundtable discussions with the membership to revise the entry pathways into the RICS to embrace inclusivity, with the outcome being published in spring 2025. The latest word is, and I quote, "It's far too early in the progress to publish any details." It was the RICS 2025 AGM this week. I joined the AGM online, and it seemed as though Rent-A-Crowd had been brought in, as each speaker was enthusiastically applauded after their same lacklustre, highly scripted presentations. I have to admit to falling asleep briefly after the first 30 minutes, and the environment for the presentations looked like a 1920s gentleman's club and gave the impression of being totally out of touch. The backdrop was a wood-panelled wall with a roll of honour going back to the 1920s. Incidentally, it looks like no feedback on pathway review until later this year at the earliest. At the Q&A session, the question of Justin Sullivan, that's Mothman, was raised, and how long the investigation would take. The response? It will take as long as it takes. It says it all. If you want my opinion, it will take until Sullivan's term of office runs out. RICS members deserve better. And now moving on to the latest rallying call from the government. Roll up your sleeves and get on with it, because it's all your fault. Some damning criticism on the state of the UK construction industry recently, when the chief executive of the new Labour PFI Quango, more on PFI later, stated that the industry was not in a fit state to deliver a project of the scale of HS2. Well, that's all very well for him to say, but the industry is trying to deal with a whole lot of problems, including skills shortages at crisis level. We have so-called tradespeople with little or no experience, and apprenticeship recruitment hasn't bounced back. It's obvious that Gen Z is not being attracted into the trades, with the result that labour costs are rising. When asked to select words to describe construction jobs in a CIOB survey, overly physical and dangerous were among the top 3 answers. The CITB and Oxford Economics looked into their collective crystal balls and released its Labour Market Intelligence Report 2025 to 2009 this week. Overall, the report was surprisingly upbeat, predicting growth over the period, despite detailing that 63,700 workers left the industry in 2024 against the need of 47,000 workers per year over the next 5 years. Lots of words being published about something must be done, but we seem to be going round in circles, as demonstrated by a recent article in Building calling for a return to back to basics, whatever that means. But it's good news for the professions, with civil engineers, surveyors and construction project managers in high demand. Then we have an increase in red tape and regulatory uncertainty. There are some pretty damning stats from the Building Safety Regulator this week, with barely 10% of Gateway 2 submissions being approved. Post-Grenfell building safety legislation was of course entirely necessary, but it has become a logistical nightmare for many trying to stay compliant. But here's breaking news just in on delays in planning approvals by the Building Safety Regulator. Don't worry, the House of Lords Industry and Regulators Committee has launched an inquiry amid calls to move the regulator away from the HSE. No quick fix, however, although evidence will be submitted until the 31st of August. Incidentally, the head of the Building Safety Regulator just announced that he is stepping down. That's the second one in 2 years. The system looks well and truly broken. Fancy his job? Applications on a small postcard, please, to add to the above soaring material and operational costs, with prices for timber, insulation, concrete, fuel and insurance still rising, resulting in paper-thin margins, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises who can't pass on increased costs. And despite a number of government name and shame initiatives, late payments and poor practice are still one of the biggest issues in construction, with subcontractors waiting 60 to 90 days or more to be paid, while still having to cover wages, suppliers, tax, VAT, etc. There's a lack of long-term vision, with infrastructure promises that are made and then cut, HS2 scaled back, implausible housing targets. Let's just get on with it. The industry needs clear, consistent guidance, not endless paperwork and conflicting interpretations. Why would anybody with half a brain want to enter the sort of industry that is Construction UK? Confidence across the sector remains fragile, with too many firms operating week to week with no clear path forward. And on the topic of blame, I don't know whether you saw a tweet from the Prime Minister last week. It appears that at last the penny has dropped that the target of building 1.5 million homes, announced as part of the government's plan for change, is unachievable, and panic has set in. The tweet said, and I paraphrase, "It's all house builders' fault for not meeting their targets as they had promised to build houses and they're not doing it. Roll up your sleeves and get on with it, otherwise we will slap you with a penalty." All of which seems to guarantee to get the construction industry on your side. As Manuel used to say in Fawlty Towers, I say nothing. The announcement followed the publication of 2 major government initiatives, placing the responsibility to deliver 1.5 million homes on the industry. The system will require house builders to set delivery timeframes prior to getting planning permission, and produce annual reports against these timeframes. If house builders fall behind without reasonable justification, no definition of what that is, they will be penalised with a new delayed homes penalty at a yet unspecified level. At least one outraged SME builder has posted a YouTube video expressing his outrage at the proposal. And while on the subject of unachievable targets, let's move on to achieving net zero in construction by 2050. Now, I don't want this podcast to sound like a political rant, and I do acknowledge that the rate at which construction industry pumps carbon emissions into the atmosphere needs to be reduced. However, figures from Future Homes Hub in June 2025 estimate that attempting to reach the government's net zero targets in housing equates to a 4 to 8% increase in building costs for a typical house, and an additional cost of approximately £5,600 compared to houses built to the 2021 standard. Others have estimated costs to reach the standard are between £5,000 and £10,000 per home, based on better insulation, triple glazing and an air source heat pump. Using infrared heating and photovoltaics to achieve a similar reduction in carbon emissions, it would be an estimated £11,600 or more. It gets worse. To reach net zero emissions, regarded by some as the holy grail, requires a heat recovery system and extensive PV, as well as air source heat pumps and thicker insulation. For this, the total cost could be an additional £20,000 per home. I recently read an article from the RICS which reported, and I quote, "Nearly half of construction professionals globally are not taking embodied carbon measurements, and there is little evidence that it is impacting on choice of materials." I don't know about you, but I have never been asked to take embodied carbon measurements, chiefly because of lack of expertise, reliable software, together with a lack of interest from clients. I think nearly half of construction professionals is a way overestimate. And finally on this topic, as part of the spending review, the government announced that it was ending funding for upgrading energy efficiency in public buildings, such as hospitals, schools, etc., in 2028. This follows the withdrawal of funding for the Low Carbon Skills Fund, and bearing in mind my previous comment about lack of skills is a major factor in convincing the industry about cutting carbon, it doesn't sound very joined up. And finally, the infrastructure strategy, which I've subtitled Jam Tomorrow. The government has announced its £752 billion 10-year infrastructure strategy. Previously, I've criticised plans for what appear to be random targets. As far as I can see, the new plan contains no targets, just loads of money, with an emphasis on critical maintenance to existing infrastructure. The overriding industry reaction to the funding review is, we need clarity, certainty and reality. Well, these high-level numbers don't mean anything without a coherent, considered strategy around their delivery. We are assured that more detail will follow in mid-July. Drip, drip, drip. The strategy is equivalent to the last government's Construction 2025, released in 2013, that outlined the government's vision of where the industry should be in 2025. The 2013 report contained several very ambitious targets, all of which have failed to be met. I really don't know how government arrives at these targets, one of which was a 50% reduction in greenhouse emissions, whereas anecdotally it is thought emissions have marginally increased. Another target was a 33% reduction in initial cost of construction. Of course, construction is used to target setting. One of the more famous targets, for those who can remember, was one set by Sir Michael Latham in his 1994 report, Trust in the Team, where a reduction of 30% in cost was called for. Now, Latham's background was as an ecclesiastical scholar, and it was rumoured to have adopted a 30% in reduction in costs from the Crine Report, or Cost Reduction in a New Era Report, recommendations into practices in North Sea oil and gas industries. Back in October 2024, I suggested in a blog that the Labour Party was thinking the unthinkable, the return of the PFI, or the Private Finance Initiative, a procurement model where private finance is used to fund large infrastructure projects. One thing is for sure, if the government wishes to apply son of PFI to healthcare, new hospitals, etc., they will have a very hard job trying to get it past the unions like the BMA. Back in the day, the first round of PFI met with a relentless anti-PFI campaign from the BMA, left-wing academics and the BMJ, the British Medical Journal. What is known so far is that one of the PFI procurement investment models announced by the Chancellor includes Regulated Asset Base, or RAB. RAB forms a part of many procurement models around the world, including the UK, where it has been used as a method of financing major infrastructure projects, particularly in the energy and water sectors. This model allows private investors to recover costs and earn a regulated return over the asset's lifetime. It provides a framework for calculating the value of the assets used in regulated services, that's to say services that are checked and controlled by a governing authority or watchdog to make sure that they meet certain requirements, standards, while protecting consumers from excessive costs. But it's not all good news, and the potential drawbacks of RAB are that consumers may bear some of the construction costs of the project from the outset, and there may be a risk of cost overruns, which could be passed on to consumers, although in some cases the government guarantees to cover additional costs above a predetermined figure. Well, that's all for this episode. I hope that you found this interesting, and thank you for listening to the end, and indeed to Season 2. Barney and me admire your stamina. This has been a podcast from Duncan Cartlidge Online. Barney and I would really appreciate it if you were to spread the word, subscribe, and if you have time, write a review. Barney and I are getting ready for our holidays. In fact, Barney has already packed his swimmies. The final podcast of Season 2 in a few weeks will be a retrospective of the season, and we'll be back with Season 3 in late August or early September. Thanks for listening, and take care.